Frances Wright, America's Forgotten Radical.
Episode 4, The Trouble with Nashoba.
America has a problem in its past, a big one. One it's still in denial about, one it can't quite shake, even after more than 2 centuries. That problem is slavery. It's still with us. Its history is still impacting our everyday lives, what we value culturally, who has money and who has power. And its problematic nature is still being shoved under the rug, with African Americans often asked to do the hard work to hide this unprocessed past and just quote unquote move on. But there's no moving on without reckoning with our country's biggest mistake.
Fanny experienced this reckoning. Fanny was enamored with America on her first trip. She romanticized it, but then she came back and began to notice that the vision of freedom-loving yeoman farmers wasn't the whole picture. Here's how she put it.
During my first visit to America, I seemed to hear and see her Declaration of Independence everywhere. I saw neither princes nor bayonets, nor a church married to the state, and conceived in very truth that liberty had here quickened the human mind, until it was prepared to act under the influence of reason instead of fear. It was true that I saw this country at a favorable moment, when peace had opened to her the ports of the world and set a second seal on her Republican liberties and national independence. It required a second visit and a more minute inspection to enable me to see things under the sober light of truth.
This sober light of truth revealed a lot about her chosen homeland. She saw slavery contradicted everything reason dictated. It could not coexist with liberty, no matter what some enslavers and their sympathizers argued. Eventually, Fanny began to ask why and what was to be done.
But while human liberty has engaged the attention of the enlightened and enlisted the feelings of the generous of all civilized nations, may we not inquire if this liberty has been rightly understood? One nation, and as yet one nation only, has declared all men born free and equal, and conquered the political freedom and equality of its citizens, with the lamentable exception, indeed, of its citizens of color.
As we mentioned last episode, Fanny saw the amazing economic feats achieved by the Harmony Society in Indiana, and she saw the intellectual vibrancy and social freedom of Robert Owen's New Harmony. She put the pieces together and came up with a plan that combined both into an antidote to slavery. That plan became Nashoba.
We talked about this plan in earlier episodes, and Cheryl Coulthart had a great breakdown of it in episode 1. But just to recap, Nashoba was an intentional community where Black and white members lived side by side. By working together, the enslaved at Nashoba would earn enough profit to pay off their purchase price rapidly, all while learning important life skills and gaining literacy and basically the education that was denied to them by law in some U.S. states. The enslaved would be manumitted and resettled to a place like Haiti, where they could live in peace. Nashoba was intended to be the model for other self-sustaining communities that would make a potentially devastating economic transition relatively easy for those economically dependent on slavery. At the same time, it would help enslaved people become citizens who could enjoy their freedom.
Now, this was a venture, even though it wasn't meant to enrich Fanny personally, and she sunk her own personal wealth into it. She sought investors and business partners, as well as donors and new members.
At first glance, this seems like an unusual, maybe even bizarre experiment and wild choice for a woman of means to make. This was a radical action.
But even radical actions are products of their times. How did the Nashoba plan fit into the broader context of American attempts to improve social conditions and into discussions of slavery? We asked a few experts to help guide us. The first is Sean Griffin, a scholar of labor history who most recently taught at the College of Charleston.
The Nashoba experiment is in the mid-1820s, which is sort of an intermediate period both for the anti-slavery and labor movements. I think it's important to sort of frame Nashoba, for all of its flaws, in the context of pre-Garrisonian immediatism, which really doesn't emerge until 1831.
Can you define immediatism for folks that might not be familiar with that term?
Yeah. So, I mean, in the literature on anti-slavery, although this can be overstated, I mean, most folks, I think, see a break around 1831, which is the year that William Lloyd Garrison first publishes The Liberator and comes out sort of guns blazing, saying, I will not equivocate, I will not hesitate, and advocates for the immediate abolition of slavery, whatever that means. And it's not always clear what that means, but it means in contrast to gradual emancipation, which had been the approach, from the Pennsylvania 1780 gradual emancipation law, through the 1820s. And also in contrast to colonization, which is the other sort of big, quote unquote, anti-slavery movement in the 18 teens and 20s. The removal, theoretically voluntary removal of formerly enslaved people after emancipating them and sending them to Liberia or Haiti or Sierra Leone or somewhere else. So she's coming up with these ideas sort of before the rise of immediatism, sort of in that gradualist, colonizationist context.
The plan for Nashoba, many of Fanny's contemporaries agreed, sounded great. But Nashoba existed not as a plan on paper, but as a community in the middle of the wilds of Western Tennessee. And more importantly, it existed in a system designed to keep slavery grinding along and to nip any impulses toward questioning it or building alliances between people across the racial divide it established.
We talked to historian Leslie Harris, a professor at Northwestern University, who gave us a great overview of the systems in place throughout early America to keep enslaved people enslaved, and often to drag free people of color into the system to boot. And this isn't just a Southern thing.
So slavery, the enslavement of people of African descent, existed in all 13 colonies practically from their foundings in the various foundings in the 17th century. And so, of course, we talk often about Virginia, 1619, the arrival of the first, we think, enslaved people. They were definitely in some form of bondage. But when we look at, and we, for a long time, have not looked at, say, New York as a center of slavery, which it definitely was. New York was both a center of enslavement in terms of the numbers of people that were enslaved there in the 17th and 18th centuries, and a center of the slave trade. And so in North America, from, say, the 1600s to the Revolutionary War, we're looking at a place where slavery is central to the economy and where laws are set up to define increasingly people of African descent in particular as the people who should be enslaved. The Virginia laws are passed in the 1660s, 1670s, and these slave codes state that Native Americans are not to be enslaved for life, but people of African descent will be, and that children born to enslaved mothers will be born into slavery and will be enslaved for life. And that there had been a question mark around whether if you converted to Christianity, should you be freed, that doors closed. So the assumption becomes by the beginning of the 18th century, by the beginning of the 1700s, that people of African descent, their normal status is enslavement. That doesn't mean there weren't free Blacks. There are, but their ability, enslaved people's ability to gain freedom and ability to remain free is quite truncated from that point forward. So when we look at, by the time of the Revolutionary War and New York, most white people see Black people as enslaved people first. They have to prove, in a sense, that they're free. That remains true, I would say, down to the Civil War. Even in the free North, for example, in the 19th century, Black people are subject to kidnapping and to being kidnapped, assumed to be fugitive slaves, and taken back south. And we have, of course, the very famous, now well-known example of Solomon Northup, who was kidnapped and is held for 12 years as an enslaved person in Louisiana, while he had been born free. His parents had been enslaved in Rhode Island, but had gained their freedom. And he grew up as a free man. He was a laborer. He was a violinist. He was a skilled worker. And he is literally kidnapped, given a new name, and told never to mention his free status, and then taken south. And only because he knows a lawyer and a judge in New York State is he able to smuggle a letter out to those people and get them to free him. Even that no one believes him when he says, no, I'm a free person. Even though he has free papers, they take those papers away from him. And they tell him that he must never talk of being a free person. So the assumption for Black people, even in the North, can be that they are assumed to be enslaved. And more pervasive and more the legacy of slavery, even in some ways down to today, of course, is racism. That enslavement is a status in which you are less than everyone else in society. And ideas of race developed during this time justify that status. The idea that Black people don't have the same intellect as white people, that they have not come from civilizations in the quote unquote old world on the African continent, that they have not come from civilized societies that are equal to European societies. These are ideas that are created during this time period. But to be clear, when European explorers went to Africa, they interacted with the leaders of quite complex societies in order to create the slave trade. So, but the racism that the racial ideologies erase that history and erase the idea that Black people and white people, given the same chances, could achieve the same things. And we're still struggling with that legacy today.
Dr. Harris will have a lot more to say about what made Nashoba complicated and what those complications say about American racial systems in episode 5.
A lot of Fanny's contemporaries, Black and white, were also calling out the system of slavery and actively organizing against it. They inspired what became the next, even bolder generation, which included folks you might be familiar with like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. They moved from Fanny's more gradualist compromise to a firm demand to end slavery immediately.
To learn more about these efforts and the social and legal context at the time, we spoke with Jack Kaufman McGivigan, history professor at Indiana University, Indianapolis, who has been instrumental in editing and publishing the papers of Frederick Douglass, as well as researching the lives of forgotten but important figures in the fight against slavery. Jack told us about the history of the anti-slavery scene, specifically about Black anti-slavery activists who saw how slavery impacted all of American culture, not just in the South, where enslaved people were most prevalent.
Yeah, the anti-slavery movement, had its start in the colonial era. Again, some of the Society of Friends or Quakers were active in that movement. Some people inspired more by Enlightenment principles like Benjamin Franklin also began to criticize slavery, but their solution in this earliest phase of abolition was a more gradual end to the institution, that it would be phased out, which is essentially what the British did, though it was a kind of quick phasing out in the Caribbean. But that's where Garrison was important. He shifted the goalposts to make a demand for immediate end of slavery, that it should not be tolerated at all for any length of time, and it must be ended completely, not through a kind of a phase out, and therefore, and also that there should be no compensation for slaveholders, which the British actually did to kind of buy or compensate slaveholders for the loss of what they considered their property, their human property.
Yeah, I only learned that in the last few years, even as a history curious person, and it was really kind of mind-blowing to think about that. Of course, it was a centerpiece for the British economic system, even if it had long been outlawed on, the soil of the British Isles, and that in order to keep their system of their economic system viable, their middle class thriving. That was the step they felt they needed to take.
Yeah, I think the the British economy is known for, its jumpstart of the industrial system, but the capital that made that possible largely came from their involvement with slavery in the Caribbean. That money extracted from slave labor essentially became the investment capital for the British Industrial Revolution.
That's so interesting because our star of this podcast, Frances Wright, her family was one of the beneficiaries, excuse me, of the Industrial Revolution, and that's where her family money came from to a great extent, and yet, so she, then she decides to go and try to come up with a system to more gradually, kind of more along the Benjamin Franklin model, more gradually kind of unwind slavery with minimal economic loss to enslavers, which was with the way you lay it out, Jack, it makes a lot of sense why that delicate dance would need to be danced. Her ultimate goal for the people she longed to liberate was for them to then go to Haiti, which had had a revolution, started its own republic run by people of African descent. And I'm curious how that kind of effort or goal fits in with into the larger picture of American abolitionism, because to our modern sensibilities, that's like, why would you have to move all the people who had come here and become American, been born on American soil? Why would they have to go back to some completely different place or to an island they've never visited?
That their family, they likely have no family.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could put that in a bit of historical context, why that would seem like the best answer for some people in the anti-slavery movement at that time.
Yes. Many of the earliest critics of slavery, even Thomas Jefferson, who criticized the institution more in a theoretical way than in a practical way, because he never does emancipate his own slaves, doubt that a society can function successfully with members of diverse races. That doubt was embedded in all American society and is used by some critics of slavery, or recognizing that some of the early critics of slavery thought the only way we can end this institution is by promising white Americans that they will not have a future in a biracial society. That we will people who are freed will be removed, and therefore will not remain in this continent or be competitors with the whites who are already here. So there was an active Back to Africa movement, or American Colonization Society, that got started in 1816 that drew upon early anti-slavery sentiment, but people, African Americans already here, resisted that, and that their resistance probably inspired people like Garrison in the 1830s to also realize that the return of people from the United States, African American slaves, their movement to the outside this continent, this was not a solution to the problem of slavery, and also kind of reinforced the racism of American society.
It's this revelation of racism and its harms that brings together the abolitionist movement as we know it, one in which free Black Americans played a vital role.
Douglas is one of an important community of free Blacks in the North who resisted slavery, not only because they objected to it morally, but also because they realized that the existence of slavery also encouraged racism across the entire country. And so they were battling not just against the institution of slavery, but the whole practice of racism, which affected their lives as well. There were important Black abolitionists before Frederick Douglass, like James Forten, David Walker, but Douglass kind of brought it to a new level because he was himself a slave. He joined the movement while he was a runaway slave. He was a slave in Maryland, who escaped from Baltimore in 1839, moved to Massachusetts, and within a few years was recruited as a speaker for the abolition movement because he could give this firsthand testimony about the evils of slavery. Also, Douglass was a very eloquent figure on the anti-slavery stage, and that just allowed the movement to say, how can you justify keeping a person of such significant abilities in an unfree state? It kind of just emphasized the immorality and the inhumane nature of the institution of slavery.
Could you talk a little bit about why public speaking was such an important component in this struggle?
Oh, yeah. Or for lots of reasons. The abolition movement was heavily inspired by evangelical preachers, that the techniques of evangelists like Charles Finney were adopted by early abolitionists. One of Finney's proteges was a man named Theodore Weld. And Theodore Weld studied to be a minister under Charles Finney, who founded Oberlin College in Ohio. But Weld decided to take the training he got to be an effective minister and use it to become an effective anti-slavery speaker. And he recruited and trained additional abolitionist lecturers who were sent out as kind of itinerant speakers to kind of cross the country, find an audience, inspire those people in the audience to found their own local anti-slavery societies. And, they used the word to kind of reach the conscience of their audience. Abolition is based on moral suasion, at least in its earlier years, that you really wanted to make the person aware of the immorality of the institution of slavery. And again, this was something that ministers obviously were trained to do, combating a range of sin or sinful behaviors. But the abolitionists just took it and narrowed it and focused on the institution of slavery and did it very effectively.
These Americans saw a different vision of America, but one based on the fundamental stated values of our country. Many of the people Jack mentioned are familiar, but he also shares some other lesser-known activists whose lives are downright inspiring.
Abolitionists, white and black, were, a minority even in the northern portion of the United States, but many of them did hold a vision of a multiracial society and believed that was something that could be achieved in this country. They were inspired by the words of the Declaration of Independence, even if its author, Jefferson, didn't always live up to them. This belief that all men are created equal was a fundamental document for this country, and therefore people of all races had a place in this nation.
It's really hopeful to know that people of that time really did hold to that interpretation. I think a lot of us who dig into American history kind of have a moment of unhappy epiphany when we realize how few of the founding fathers lived up to that dream. So it is really great to focus on the abolitionists who wanted to hold to that dream.
Yeah, my own advisor when I was a graduate student, his name Merton Dillon, and Dillon wrote an influential book called Abolitionists, the Dissenting Minority. And he acknowledged that they were a minority, but they were an important minority that kind of set the pattern for what American society could become, that the all-embracing, accepting type of society.
It's when you were speaking, Jack, I was getting a little bit of those Midwestern tears starting to bud here. I think it's important, though, for us to acknowledge that this is not a contemporary rewriting of history, that these dynamics have been happening in the U.S. and this conversation's been going on since basically the Declaration of Independence. So looking at this movement in the antebellum period, are there any favorite figures that you'd like to share with everyone? Any amazing American abolitionists you felt have kind of fallen through the cracks of the historical narrative?
Well, I mentioned Theodore Weld. Another one's been a long favorite of mine, and also a favorite of Frederick Douglass was a New York, I guess today we call him a land developer named Garrett Smith, who owned a sizable amount of land in western upstate New York. And he was aware that the Constitution of New York at this time, had abolished slavery gradually, but left many discriminatory provisions that African Americans, again, it was males because of the gender prejudice of this time period. African American males were not able to vote unless they could demonstrate that they owned property worth more than $250. That requirement had been abolished for whites, but remained on African Americans. And Smith, because he owned so much land, simply began to deed it to every African American he knew in New York State.
Amazing.
That's direct action right there.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And he was so wealthy, it didn't hurt him at all. Smith also was important for propagating the idea that the Constitution of the United States was an anti-slavery document. Most earlier abolitionists believed that the Constitution, had been drawn up by those framers and made an important compromise with the institution of slavery. Abolitionists like Smith, and Smith that converts Frederick Douglass to this position, believed that the Constitution, based upon the principles of the Declaration of Independence, was inherently anti-slavery, and that the government, the federal government, if Congress could be controlled by opponents of slavery, could simply pass legislation and end that institution. And so championed political abolitionism and ran for president several times. Obviously, he didn't win, but he used it as a technique to keep this debate going in political circles, as Americans are very politically minded, that this was one more way of kind of reaching out to people and disseminating anti-slavery ideas and concepts.
While we're thinking of abolitionists who work together across racial divides, let's take a look at the dialogue and collaboration between people advocating for workers' rights and people looking to free slave people. This was an intersection where Fanny operated, and it was really important to her. Here's Sean Griffin again. A bit of context here. By the time of Wright's Nashoba experiment, the rise of industrialization and wage labor had introduced a new phrase to the lexicon: wage slavery. Labor reformers and others who used this phrase argued that factory workers who toiled for low wages in abysmal conditions were little better off than slaves. Note that phrases like wage slavery and white slavery could be used to make both pro- and anti-slavery arguments, depending on who was wielding them and to what end.
Anti-slavery Northerners generally, and like abolitionists, shared the conviction that slavery robbed the worker of the fruits of his or her labor. And, more broadly, that slavery represented the polar opposite of freedom. And that is, in fact, why they resorted so frequently to the use of metaphors like wages slavery or white slavery, which, there's a whole literature on the wage slavery debates, which is sort of, that language was ubiquitous in the period and certainly was in the labor movement as well. But, and some of these labor reformers, even seem to have sincerely believed that certain forms of oppressed wage labor were the equivalent of chattel slavery. But on the other hand, I think the communitarians in particular, the land reformers in particular, also prodded abolitionists to consider more deeply where the limitations of property rights lay, for example, in an evolving, market-based capitalistic society. The abolitionists made property and man, property and human beings, the sort of sine qua non of slavery and what was wrong, what was sinful about slavery. So if human beings could not be considered a legitimate form of property, working class reformers were sort of pushing the question, well, should land be considered a legitimate form of property? Could an individual's labor be alienated from them and turned into a commodity on the market? What about other natural resources, air, water, etc.? So that's one way. And, the other place I see them coming together is really through political anti-slavery, the political abolitionists and of the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, and eventually the Republican Party. The heart of my book is really about how labor reformers sort of pioneered some of these arguments that become foundational to those movements. Which the default assumption is that there was, almost no interracial collaboration or racial integration outside of the Garrisonian immediatist abolitionist movement. So the ways in which I found free African Americans taking part in some of these reform movements, in many cases they were independently developing similar ideas about, for example, the need for access to land or access to the skilled trades. They're calling for manual labor education in the 1830s and 40s. A few, including very prominent figures like Frederick Douglass and Henry Highland Garnett, as well as less well-known folks like Willis Hodges and the editors of the Anglo-African magazine. Some of them by the 1850s were endorsing land reform and or communitarian ideas, and to some extent that also overlaps with their sort of shift from Garrisonianism to political abolitionism. But maybe even more surprisingly is the fact that land and labor movements sometimes included Black people or solicited their participation. Again, at a time when this kind of thing is extremely rare. So, for example, John C. Bowers, who was a free Black activist from Philadelphia, served as a delegate to the National Industrial Congress, which was sort of the main, sort of pre-Civil War, national attempt to form a national sort of umbrella labor organization, albeit there was some internal dissension about his being seated, but ultimately at the end of the day, he wins out and is seated. And then a couple of years later, William H. Day, who's a African-American activist in Michigan, is one of the Congress's secretaries. The National Reform Association, which is the working class land reform group, apparently included Black members, and its lecturers spoke in front of all Black audiences. There's the Gerrit Smith's collaboration with free Black leaders and a land reform project, which has been written about elsewhere and is better known. But these things are exceptions to the rule. But really, before I did the research for this book, I had never encountered any evidence of white labor organizations, including African Americans before the Civil War. And then, of course, even afterwards, it's rare. There are groups like the Knights of Labor that incorporate Blacks in separate unions or separate locals. But so in a way, I think these things anticipate not only later efforts like that, but some of the experiments in racial democracy that took place during the Civil War and Reconstruction. In terms of right sort of placement, I think they represent a progression, albeit not a steady one, but a limited one, at least from Frances Wright's time, when the ideas of Blacks and whites cooperating together, as equal participants was really unthinkable.
We'll link to Sean's book and ways you can learn more about all our guests this week in the show notes. It's important to see the nuances of antebellum abolitionist thinking and see how Nashoba fits into all of this. So if anti-slavery sentiment has a long history in America, and there were some Americans who could imagine a multiracial nation, why did Nashoba fail, Tristra?
Well, there's some really practical frontier issues, you could say, frontier problems, hashtag, and personal stuff that led to a lot of difficulties at Nashoba. So, for instance, George Flower, who we heard a lot about in episode 3, had to leave. He had some family issues that came up, and he returned to Illinois. At the same time, Fanny and her sister Camilla and several other members of the community got super sick with malaria. Malaria was a big problem in the U.S. at the time. I know it's kind of unusual to think about nowadays, but malaria killed lots of people on what was then the Western frontier. Fanny got so sick that everyone decided the best option was for her to go back to Europe. So she was basically away from her community for months on end, trying to recover from this devastating disease. The other big factor was the economic vulnerability of the way, just basically based on the nature of Nashoba itself and how it was designed, right? It's part of the system, right? They're trying to create profit by growing a commodity crop, which was cotton. And they kind of hope that cooperative labor might give them this sort of secret advantage. But if you're facing a very, very volatile commodity market, as the market was in the 19th century, it was crazy, prone to crashes that were pretty dramatic, you're going to struggle to get that profit. And they really experienced that firsthand. They really, really struggled to make things work, even when they had a relatively, okay growing season. So basically, you end up being a plantation, just like everyone else. But one of the factors that is really important and shouldn't make us, should prevent us from getting too romantic about Fanny and Nashoba is the underlying theme of white supremacy and the paternalism of this enterprise, right? So, and you can really see there were some events that happened at Nashoba that led to its undoing in a way and to a lot of scandal. When Fanny went to Europe to try to recover from malaria, she left Nashoba in the hands of a man named James Richardson and her sister Camilla. Neither of them were experienced in running a farm, and both of them were deeply sunk in this system. So we have records of James Richardson basically using the techniques of a plantation overseer, and he exhibited sort of terrible mismanagement and ended up abusing several of the enslaved people there. And then he reported it widely to the abolitionist press. And we'll get into all of that in the next episode and exactly what was so distressing to the anti-slavery public at the time. But what I wanted to point out here is that these events, which I really do think undermined the project incredibly, point to the problem with being paternalistic, right? You can't escape that power dynamic. And if you're trying to sort of apply and use those methods of control, once you sort of look at this, it's really easy to lose the romance and enthusiasm for this particular community. So yeah, it's a difficult, but again, it kind of points to the dilemma. How can you work within a system to end a system? And the answer may be you can't.
Well, I'm looking forward to the next episode where we're going to explore that more deeply. But I want to hear more from the ground at Nashoba. Did anyone write about the Nashoba project who was actually there?
Oh, Eleanor. In addition to, James Richardson and the records I just mentioned, I got someone for you and sent someone good. So I want you to read this little passage from Frances Trollope. Now, for those of you out there who are 19th century literature fans, you have probably heard of Frances. You may have also heard of her novelist son. She's a bit of a lady whistledown. She's kind of a bit of a troublemaker, but she traveled America and wrote a book about it. And this is from her popular book, Manners of the Americans. So she was friends with Frances Wright and other notable people of her time. And for a variety of reasons, she went to Tennessee thinking she should join Fanny's community. Things went a little sideways, but I'll let you read the passage and see what you think.
Okay. It must have been some feeling equally powerful which enabled Miss Wright, accustomed to all the comfort and refinement of Europe, to imagine not only that she herself could exist in this wilderness, but that her European friends could enter there and not feel dismayed at the savage aspect of the scene. Each building consisted of 2 large rooms, furnished in the most simple manner, nor had they as yet collected around them any of those minor comforts which ordinary minds class among the necessaries of life. But in this, our philosophical friend seemed to see no evil. Nor was there any mixture of affectation in this indifference. It was a circumstance really and truly beneath her notice. Her whole heart and soul were occupied by the hope of raising the African to the level of European intellect. And even now that I have seen this favorite fabric of her imagination fall to pieces beneath her feet, I cannot recall the self-devotion with which she gave herself to it without admiration. I think they had between 30 and 40 slaves, including children, but when I was there, no school had been established. Books and other materials for the great experiment had been collected, and 1 or 2 professors engaged, but nothing was yet organized. I do not exactly know what was the immediate cause which induced Miss Wright to abandon a scheme which had taken such possession of her imagination, and on which she had expended so much money. But many months had not elapsed before I learned, with much pleasure, that she and her sister had also left it. I think it probable that she became aware, upon returning to Nashoba, that the climate was too hostile for their health. All I know farther of Nashoba is that Miss Wright, having found, from some cause or other, that it was impossible to pursue her object, herself accompanied her slaves to Haiti and left them there free and under the protection of the president.
I like how Frances Trollope is kind of protecting her friend. Like, I don't really know why all fell apart.
I get a little passive aggression there.
I know. A lot of,
Yeah.
Anyway, she did get one thing right, and that was that Fanny did have to dismantle Nashoba, and she did take the enslaved Nashobans to Haiti at her own expense, which was the only free republic governed by people of African heritage at the time. So I think she felt it was the best option. And Nashoba fell apart. Okay, so if this is all a failure, if this is kind of a weird, paternalistic, strange experiment, why are we going so deep into this short period in Fanny's life, which is just a few years and a long and colorful career? Well, Nashoba touches on why slavery and the racial system it created remains so resilient today, despite centuries of calls for change. Radical actions alone don't do much to unwind that system, and the radical actors are just as caught up in the same power dynamics between enslaved and enslaver, and the same economic forces. That said, maybe Nashoba's failure was its success in a weird way. As an experiment, it proved that this kind of compromise situation maybe didn't work. The next phase of the anti-slavery movement involved far less compromising language, far more stringent moral demands, and included people of all races working together to insist slavery had to end immediately, no ifs or buts. And that African Americans are first and foremost Americans who should enjoy all the rights of citizens.
So to end this episode, we want to talk about some other women who are woefully underappreciated, specifically the African American activists and orators who fought their own bold battle against the system that insisted on denying their obvious intelligence, beauty, and dignity.
So let's look at another orator, one who was actively writing at the same time as Fanny. Her name was Maria W. Stewart, a free woman of color from Boston who spoke out boldly and eloquently in favor of women's rights and abolition. A teacher and political speaker, she is one of the very first women of any background to speak publicly before an audience of both men and women. This excerpt is from an address given in 1833 titled, "What If I Am a Woman?" In this lecture, Stewart traces the history of highly accomplished and praised women and argues fiercely to place Black women among their past and future ranks.
What if I am a woman? You will find that several of the northern nations imagined that women could look into futurity and that they had about them an inconceivable something approaching to divinity. A belief that the deity more readily communicates himself to women has at one time or other prevailed in every quarter of the earth. If women, as were here described, once existed, be no longer astonished then, my brethren and friends, that God, at this eventful period, should raise up your own females to strive by their example, both in public and private, to assist those who are endeavoring to stop the strong current of prejudice that flows so profusely against us at present.
Wow, that's a moving testament to the eloquence and bravery of 19th century African American activists. Maria, I think you need your own podcast.
I really think you do too, Maria. So we're going to be moving on a little bit, and in the next episode, we'll dive deeper into what really undermined Nashoba's impact, a visceral reaction to what at the time was called amalgamation, a force so potent, myriad American laws were crafted to prevent it, or even the whiff of it, a phantom that caused riots while remaining a disturbing constant of everyday life for many Americans.
What is it? Find out in 2 more weeks. Readings in this episode were by Emily McGee and Dunia Best Sinreich.
Frances Wright, America's Forgotten Radical is a co-production of New Year Media and Her Reputation for Accomplishment, written and hosted by Eleanor Rust and Tristra Yeager.
Made possible by a grant from the Working Men's Institute, New Harmony, Indiana, and by the generosity of the Ephraimson Family Fund. Thanks also to the Bloomington Area Arts Council for supporting this podcast.
Music by Eleanor Dubinsky. Editing and audio support by Josh Perez. See you next time.